She pleaded for only one thing, a single flight, one final chance to hold her mother's hand before death took her forever. Instead, her husband struck a match, set her passport ablaze in front of his entire family, and laughed as it curled into ashes. His mistress stood nearby, recording every second with a grin on her face. What none of them understood was that thousands of miles away, a dying woman had already made a decision that would change everything. By the time the flames died, Adaeze had become untouchable, and the people mocking her had no idea their own downfall had already begun. Some women carry suffering so quietly that the people causing it mistake their silence for weakness. They sit through insults disguised as jokes. They endure humiliation served across dinner tables. They watch themselves become strangers inside homes they helped build. But silence is not always surrender. Sometimes it is patience. Sometimes it is strategy. The most dangerous people are often the ones no one considers a threat. They shrink themselves for a season, not because they are powerless, but because they are waiting for the exact moment when the truth can no longer be ignored. And when that moment arrives, it rarely comes with shouting. It arrives quietly and leaves devastation behind. Adaeze was that kind of woman. And on the night her husband humiliated her in front of his mother, his brother, his sister, and the woman he openly paraded as his girlfriend, she was already stepping into a future none of them could imagine. While they laughed at her pain, fate was rearranging the board beneath their feet. It was a chilly Thursday evening near the end of October. Outside the house on Briarwood Drive, the trees blazed with deep reds and fading golds. From inside, the view looked beautiful. From outside, it felt cold, lonely, and final, like the last page of a chapter someone wasn't ready to finish.
Welcome to Wild Shadow Tales, your home for stories that stay with you long after the screen goes dark. If you love powerful, emotional, and jaw dropping stories, subscribe now and never miss a single one.
The house was crowded that night, not with warmth, but with the kind of familiar tension that had settled into the walls over the past 2 years. Every gathering reminded Adaeze that somewhere along the way, the meaning of home had changed. It was still her address, but it no longer felt like her place. At the head of the dining table sat Claudette, Darnell's mother. She carried herself like a queen on a throne. In her mind, she had always been the true authority in that house, even though the mortgage carried another woman's name. She had spent 11 years barely tolerating Adaeze, treating basic respect as though it were an act of extraordinary generosity. Across from her sat Darnell's brother, Tyrese, stretched comfortably in his chair with a toothpick between his teeth. He laughed loudly at his own jokes, the kind of laugh that demanded attention whether anyone else found him funny or not. Beside him sat Renee, scrolling endlessly through her phone, offering occasional smiles at things happening on her screen while barely acknowledging the people around her. And then there was Simone. Simone wasn't sitting near Adaeze's seat. She was sitting in Adaeze's seat, the exact chair Adaeze had occupied every evening for more than a decade. The chair closest to the kitchen. The chair where she had spent years serving meals, sharing conversations, and pretending things would improve. She knew every scratch in its wood, every creak in the floor beneath it. Yet tonight, Simone sat there as though she had always belonged. Her elbows rested comfortably on the table, her chin balanced on folded hands, her smile relaxed and confident. She looked less like a guest and more like a replacement. Adaeze wasn't at the table. She stood alone in the hallway with her back against the wall and her phone pressed tightly against her ear. On the other end was a sound she knew she would never forget for the rest of her life. Her mother's breathing. Weak, slow, painfully strained. Each breath sounded like a battle being fought and lost at the same time. 2 hours earlier, a nurse had called from overseas. Nkechi's condition had worsened rapidly. The message had been clear. If Adaeze wanted to see her mother alive one last time, she needed to leave immediately. Not tomorrow, not next week. Now, for several seconds after the call ended, Adaeze remained frozen in the hallway. One hand rested against the wall as she absorbed the weight of what she had just heard. Grief pressed against her chest, heavy and suffocating. But she knew the people in the dining room would not carry that burden with her. So she did what she had always done. She composed herself, She smoothed the front of her dress, remembering her mother's favorite advice. Always enter a room like you belong there. Then she walked toward the dining room. Slowly, deliberately. Years earlier, she had learned a painful lesson. Showing emotion around Darnell only gave him an excuse to dismiss her. If she cried, she was irrational. If she raised her voice, she was dramatic. If she defended herself, she was difficult. So she approached the table calmly. She waited until Darnell looked up. Then she explained everything. She told him about the nurse's call. She told him her mother's condition had become critical. She explained she needed the first available flight and asked for her passport. The passport was locked inside the safe. She knew exactly where the safe was. What she didn't know was the combination. Darnell had changed it 2 years earlier without discussing it with her. At the time, he had called it a security precaution. She had accepted the explanation because arguing had become exhausting. Inside that safe were more than travel documents. There were copies of financial records, important agreements, family documents, even an old laminated card containing her mother's contact information, a silly gift they had once laughed about together. Everything she needed was behind that steel door, and only Darnell could open it. Adaeze asked respectfully, carefully, with every remaining piece of dignity she possessed. She wasn't asking for money. She wasn't asking for forgiveness. She wasn't asking for permission to live her life. She was simply asking for one chance to say goodbye to her dying mother. Darnell stared at her with the same cold indifference he had shown for the last 2 years. He chewed his food, swallowed, took a sip from his glass. Then, without saying a word, he pushed back his chair and walked toward the study. And despite everything, hope betrayed her. For one brief second, she believed he was going to help. She imagined him opening the safe, handing over the passport, showing a trace of the man she had once loved. But when he returned, he was holding the passport in one hand and something else in the other. A lighter. The room grew strangely quiet. Darnell held the passport up for everyone to see as if it were a joke prop in a performance. Then he walked to the kitchen sink and lit it. The flame caught instantly. Orange fire crawled across the edges. The pages curled inward, blackened, collapsed. He held it over the drain and watched it burn with the satisfaction of a man completing a task he had planned long before that moment. Because this wasn't impulsive. He had gone to get the lighter. He had thought about it, chosen it, wanted it. And while the passport turned to ash, he watched Adaeze's face. Not the fire, her face. Watching for the pain, waiting for it, enjoying it. Then he smiled. Claudette was the first to laugh. A loud, triumphant laugh filled the room. The laugh of someone who believed she had finally won. She shook her head and told Adaeze she should have considered the consequences before embarrassing the family. She spoke as though everyone understood the accusation, as though there was some crime Adaeze had committed. But the truth was far uglier, because nobody in that room was laughing at what Adaeze had done. They were laughing because they believed she had nowhere left to go. For a moment, nobody said anything. Then Tyrese leaned back in his chair and slowly shook his head, wearing the expression of a man pretending wisdom had led him to a conclusion he had actually reached years ago. Renee was already holding up her phone. The camera was recording before the flames had even finished consuming the passport. She believed every humiliation deserved an audience. If it wasn't captured, shared, and replayed, then in her mind it had never fully happened. Tonight, she wanted proof. But Simone was different. She didn't laugh. She didn't speak. She simply remained seated in Adaeze's chair, watching from across the room with a faint smile that somehow felt crueler than everyone else's reaction combined. Laughter was noise. A smile like that was judgment. It was ownership. It was the expression of someone who believed the battle had already been won. Adaeze watched until the final charred fragment of her passport broke apart and disappeared down the drain. She stood there in complete silence. No tears, no screaming, no desperate pleading, nothing. She refused to give them the performance they had gathered to enjoy. The room had expected heartbreak. Instead, they received stillness. When the last piece vanished, Adaeze turned away and walked down the hallway. No dramatic exit, no slammed door, just a soft click as the bedroom door closed behind her. Yet somehow that quiet sound carried more weight than any explosion of anger ever could. Inside the room, darkness wrapped around her like a blanket. She sat carefully on the edge of the bed and listened. The dinner continued. Silverware scraped against plates. Claudette's voice floated through the walls. Tyrese burst into laughter every few minutes. Life carried on as if nothing extraordinary had happened, as if they hadn't just trapped a woman in the worst moment of her life. Adaeze inhaled slowly. Then her phone vibrated. Once. Only once. She picked it up and saw the notification she had ignored the previous day. A law firm. A name she didn't recognize. The message was short. Urgent. Estate matter regarding Nkechi Okafor. Please contact us immediately. For several seconds, she stared at the screen. Something about the wording unsettled her. Estate matter. Not medical matter. Not family emergency. Estate. A strange feeling moved through her chest. Then she locked the phone and placed it face down on the nightstand. She wasn't ready. Not yet. She lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling. Beyond the walls, laughter continued. The laughter of people convinced they had taken everything from her. The laughter of people who believed power belonged to them. And somewhere deep inside herself, Adaeze felt something shift. Not break. Shift. For 11 years, she had survived through patience. Through endurance. Through compromise. But patience was beginning to move aside for something else. Something older. Something stronger. It felt like a river pressing against a dam. Not rushing. Not panicking. Just gathering force. Waiting. Waiting for the exact moment the barrier could no longer hold. To understand what was happening inside Adaeze that night, you have to go much further back. Long before Darnell. Long before marriage. Long before Briarwood Drive. You have to go back to Atlanta. Back to a neighborhood where houses stood shoulder to shoulder and vegetable gardens stretched along chain-link fences. Summer afternoons carried the smell of spices and fresh cooking from one open window to another. Children played outside until sunset, and everybody knew which house served the best food on the block. Inside one of those houses stood a woman named Nkechi Okafor. Without question, she was the strongest person Adaeze had ever known. Nkechi wasn't born into comfort. Nothing had been handed to her. Every opportunity she possessed had been built with her own hands. She arrived in America at 23 carrying a single suitcase, a cousin's phone number, and an accent she had spent years carefully refining before she ever boarded a plane. She cleaned houses, then she hired helpers, then she expanded, then she incorporated the company under her own name. Years later, she moved into property acquisition, then commercial management, then energy infrastructure contracts. And that was where everything changed. The numbers became too large. The profits became impossible to ignore. The same people who had spent decades underestimating her suddenly found themselves asking for meetings. And for the first time, they had no choice but to acknowledge her success. She accomplished all of it while raising a daughter alone. Adaeze's father had been a good man, the kind who sang off-key without embarrassment, the kind who could make a child laugh after the worst day imaginable. When Adaeze was 6 years old, he died unexpectedly from a heart attack. One ordinary day, he was there. The next day, he wasn't. Nkechi buried her husband. She mourned him. Then she stood back up and kept building. Because grief didn't eliminate responsibility. And a little girl was depending on her. She never sat Adaeze down for speeches about strength. She never delivered grand lectures. She simply lived it. And Adaeze watched. That was the lesson. That was the education. Nkechi wasn't gentle in the way people often expect mothers to be. She never lied about how difficult life could become. She never promised fairness where fairness didn't exist. She taught reality, but she loved with a depth that made reality easier to survive. She always knew when her daughter was hurting, even before Adaeze knew herself. Her hands could calm panic. Her voice could quiet fear. Her presence alone could make a room feel safe. The morning Adaeze left for college, Nkechi did something unusual, something she never repeated. She opened an old wooden jewelry box worn smooth by years of use. From inside, she removed a delicate gold pendant hanging from a thin chain. The pendant was shaped like an open hand. a hand that looked as though it could be offering a gift, or releasing one, or catching one, depending on how you viewed it. Nkechi placed it into Adaeze's palm and closed her fingers around it. Then she said something Adaeze would spend years trying to understand. This is the hand of a woman who never begs twice. Adaeze smiled. Her mother didn't. Nkechi told her to wear it every day. She told her there would come a moment when she would finally understand its meaning. And when that moment arrived, she would need it more than anything else. At 18, Adaeze thought it sounded dramatic. Now, she would later realize it sounded prophetic. She wore the pendant to college, to every class, to graduation, to the ceremony where she finished at the top of her business program. She wore it the day she received an exciting job offer in New York. And she wore it the day she met Darnell. Back then, he seemed confident, ambitious, and certain of himself. At 22, certainty can look a lot like character. Persistence can look like devotion. Charm can look like love. Darnell pursued her relentlessly, and she mistook intensity for depth. Many people do. She married him, believing they would build a future together. The pendant rested against her neck on her wedding day. It remained there through 11 years of marriage. 11 years during which something beautiful slowly transformed into something restrictive. Her New York career opportunity disappeared in the first year because Darnell needed her nearby. Friendships faded. Professional ambitions faded. Financial independence faded. One piece at a time. The walls closed, and so gradually she barely noticed them moving. Until one day, she realized how little space remained. Yet through all of it, she kept wearing the pendant. The final gift from a mother who had seen further ahead than anyone else. Every Sunday, for 11 years, Adaeze called Nkechi. No matter what. Sometimes they discussed business. Sometimes recipes. Sometimes memories. Sometimes nothing important at all. Nkechi never criticized Darnell directly. That wasn't her style. But there were moments during those calls when silence stretched a little too long. Moments when Adaeze could almost hear her mother thinking. 3 years into the marriage, Nkechi said something strange. At the time, Adaeze laughed. Years later, those words would return like a warning. I built something for you, baby. Not for them. For you. And when the time comes, you'll know exactly what to do with it. Adaeze laughed and teased her. Mama, you always sound like you're hiding secrets. But Nkechi didn't smile. She simply replied, good. Then she changed the subject. The days following the passport incident passed with an eerie quietness. On the surface, life looked normal. Tea was made. Laundry was folded. Windows were opened. Meals were cooked. But underneath, something violent was taking place. Not outside. Inside. Something fundamental was rearranging itself. The following Monday, Darnell froze her access to their joint account. Adaeze discovered it at a grocery store checkout line. Her card declined. Then declined again. The cashier looked uncomfortable. The woman waiting behind her sighed loudly. Embarrassed, Adaeze quietly removed several items from her basket and counted the cash she had left in her wallet. Standing there, she felt a realization settle into her bones. The ground she thought she was standing on had never truly belonged to her. That evening she asked Darnell what happened. His answer came instantly. I'm restructuring our finances. Nothing more. No discussion. No explanation. No concern. Just a statement delivered in the cold, final tone he reserved for decisions he believed she had no right to question. And for the first time in years, Adaeze didn't argue. She simply looked at him, because something had already begun. And soon, everyone in that house would discover just how expensive their cruelty was going to become. After the passport incident, the pressure didn't ease. It intensified. Claudette began calling more often, always in the afternoon, always with the same syrupy tone that pretended concern while carefully measuring weakness. She asked how Adaeze spent her days, whether she had considered finding a job, whether she felt lonely sitting around the house. Every question sounded harmless on the surface. None of them were. Each one was designed to remind Adaeze that, in Claudette's eyes, she had already become irrelevant. And then there were the comparisons. Sometimes Claudette mentioned Simone directly. More often, she didn't need to. She would simply say things like, some women naturally know how to support a successful man. Or, not everyone understands how important peace is in a relationship. The message was always the same. You failed. Someone else replaced you. Accept it. Renee added her own contribution to the humiliation. On Thursday evening, she uploaded the video. Just a few seconds long. The burning passport. The flames. Adaeze walking away. Claudette's laughter ringing in the background. The caption contained only one word. Growth. The comments underneath revealed something Adaeze had always suspected but never fully confirmed. People weren't merely watching her pain. They were celebrating it. She read the comments once. Only once. Then she closed the page and never looked again. Tyrese visited the house the following week. He leaned casually against the kitchen counter and delivered the news as though he were discussing weather. You should start planning your next move. Adaeze looked at him. What does that mean? He shrugged. The family already decided. Not Darnell. Not Simone. The family. As though her future had become a group project. As though her life belonged to a committee. And Tyrese said it with complete confidence because people often mistake repeated cruelty for truth. Meanwhile, Simone's presence became impossible to ignore. She appeared everywhere. The dry cleaner Adaeze had used for years. The coffee shop where the barista knew her order before she spoke. The church she had attended every Sunday for nearly a decade. Simone never approached her, never confronted her, never even acknowledged her directly. She simply existed in those spaces, comfortably, confidently, as if she were testing out a life she planned to keep. And somehow that was worse, because it sent a message without requiring a single word. I'm not hiding. I'm not ashamed. And I am not leaving. Darnell, meanwhile, began conducting what he called conversations. Over the course of 2 weeks, he sat Adaeze down several times. Always calm, always reasonable, always rehearsed. He spoke about fairness, about moving forward, about being honest with themselves. He explained that the house belonged to him, that Simone had been patient, that his family already loved her, that perhaps some relationships simply reached their natural ending. He never raised his voice. He never showed anger. And somehow that made it worse. Because cruelty wrapped in politeness often cuts deeper than cruelty wrapped in rage. Adaeze listened, quietly, not because she agreed, not because she surrendered, but because something had changed inside her. The silence she carried now wasn't weakness. It was inheritance. The same stillness her mother carried into boardrooms filled with men who expected her to fail. The same stillness that allowed her to negotiate billion-dollar deals while others mistook composure for compliance. Adaeze had begun to understand. And once understanding arrives, fear begins to lose its grip. Then the law firm called again. Wednesday afternoon. This time she answered. The attorney introduced himself as Mr. Ellington. His voice was calm and deliberate, the voice of someone accustomed to delivering life-changing information. He explained that her mother had spent more than a decade quietly building a financial structure. Not for herself, for Adaeze. Every piece of it, every decision, every transfer, every layer, it had all been intentional. Mr. Ellington informed her that the central company within that structure was called Okafor Holdings. And then he said something that made Adaeze stop breathing for a moment. The company had been established in her name. 11 years ago, on the morning of her wedding. Adaeze sat down slowly. The room suddenly felt smaller. Mr. Ellington continued. Okafor Holdings controlled commercial real estate across 6 states. Energy infrastructure contracts extending 15 years into the future. International investment portfolios that had quietly grown for over a decade. Dozens of subsidiary companies. Assets spread across multiple industries. All legally owned by one person. Adaeze Okafor Daniels. Then came a number. The number that changed everything. $59 billion. Silence filled the room. Outside her bedroom window, autumn leaves drifted from the branches of the old oak tree. One after another. Slowly, Mr. Ellington waited. He had delivered shocking news before. He understood that certain numbers required time. Adaeze finally found her voice. I'm sorry. How much? He repeated it. Exactly. She asked if there was any mistake. There wasn't. She asked whether it could be challenged. It couldn't. She asked if everything was legally protected. Mr. Ellington almost laughed. Nkechi Okafor didn't leave loose ends. Then he revealed something even more shocking. The planning had begun the year she married Darnell. Not recently, not after problems appeared. The year they married, which meant her mother had seen something on that wedding day. Something Adaeze herself wouldn't fully recognize for another 11 years. The legal protections were airtight. The ownership structures were complete. The safeguards were extraordinary. Nkechi had spent over a decade ensuring her daughter would never truly be trapped. No matter who tried, no matter how hard they tried. After the call ended, Adaeze remained seated on the edge of the bed. The phone rested loosely in her hand. She stared through the window without seeing anything. Then her fingers rose slowly to the pendant hanging at her throat. The open hand, palm upward, the symbol she had worn for years without fully understanding. Offering, receiving, releasing, protecting. For the first time, the meaning became clear. Her mother hadn't simply left her wealth. She had left her freedom. And suddenly Adaeze felt something deeper than relief, deeper than excitement, deeper even than grief. Recognition, as if she were finally meeting the woman she was always meant to become. A few minutes later, she called Mr. Ellington back. When he answered, her voice was steady. "I'm ready." 3 weeks later, on a crisp Friday evening in November, Darnell hosted the most important event of his year, his annual charity gala. The Grand Meridian Ballroom glowed with chandeliers, polished marble, and carefully curated luxury. This was Darnell's kingdom, the room where deals were born, where reputations were maintained, where powerful people reminded one another why they mattered. He had spent months preparing for the evening. Every table assignment, every guest list adjustment, every speech, every detail. And when he arrived with Simone on his arm, he felt exactly what he wanted to feel. Successful, admired, untouchable. Simone's red gown drew attention immediately. Heads turned. Whispers followed. Darnell enjoyed every second. Claudette and Renee were already seated. Tyrese occupied his usual position near the bar, trapping strangers inside long stories they clearly wanted to escape. The ballroom buzzed with wealth, influence, and self-importance. And Darnell moved through it comfortably. This was his world, or so he believed. Then Adaeze walked in. Alone. No announcement. No entourage. No dramatic entrance. She simply appeared, and somehow that made every head turn. She wore a navy gown that carried elegance without trying to demand attention. At her throat rested the familiar gold pendant. The chandelier light touched it briefly before moving on. Adaeze crossed the ballroom with calm certainty. Not arrogance. Not performance. Certainty. The kind that cannot be borrowed. The kind that comes from finally knowing exactly who you are. People stepped aside without realizing they were doing it. Conversations paused. Eyes followed her. Across the room, Darnell noticed immediately. His first reaction was confusion. His second was irritation. His third was something far more dangerous. Unease. Because this wasn't the woman he'd spent years controlling. This wasn't the woman whose passport he burned. This wasn't the woman he had slowly convinced was powerless. Something was different. She occupied space differently, walked differently, looked at people differently. There was no hesitation left, no shrinking, no apologizing. She looked like someone carrying a secret, and Darnell suddenly realized he didn't know what it was. The evening program began. Sponsors were acknowledged. Guests were thanked. Foundation members received recognition. Everything unfolded according to schedule. Then the host paused. The room quieted. A smile spread across his face. He announced that the foundation had received the largest private contribution in its history. Not from a corporation, not from a government grant, from a privately owned holding company. A donation so substantial it would fund the organization's work for the next 20 years. The ballroom erupted into surprised murmurs. Then the company name appeared on the massive screen. Okafor Holdings. Bright white letters. Black background. The reaction was immediate. People exchanged glances. Some recognized the name. Many didn't. But everyone understood the significance. A donation of that size came from serious power. Across the ballroom, Darnell frowned. The name meant nothing to him. Yet something about it unsettled him. A tiny crack appeared in his confidence. Then, Mr. Ellington approached the podium. His presence immediately commanded attention. He thanked the foundation, thanked the guests, then spoke about a remarkable woman who had spent 3 decades building an extraordinary legacy. A woman who had planned not only for her success, but for her daughter's future. He spoke about inheritance, responsibility, legacy, strength, and finally he said, "It is my privilege to introduce the sole owner and principal leader of Okafor Holdings." The room became completely silent. Mr. Ellington turned. Every camera followed. Every guest turned. Every conversation died. And then his eyes settled on Adaeze. So did everyone else's, including Darnell's. And in that moment, for the first time in 11 years, he realized he had absolutely no idea who his wife really was. The silence that followed was unlike anything Darnell had ever experienced. It wasn't shock alone. It was realization. The entire ballroom seemed to pause as hundreds of people simultaneously reconsidered everything they thought they knew about the woman standing before them. Near the back of the room, a financial journalist suddenly straightened in her seat. She knew that name. 2 weeks earlier, she had written a brief note about a massive private estate transfer that had quietly passed through legal channels. $59 billion. The heir had remained anonymous, and the story had barely attracted attention. Until now. Now, the woman from that article was standing less than 30 feet away, and everyone was staring at her, including the man who had spent years trying to convince her she was nothing. Darnell moved first. Fast. Too fast. He crossed the ballroom with the desperate urgency of a man watching control slip through his fingers. When he reached Adaeze, he gently grabbed her elbow and lowered his voice. "Adaeze, we need to talk." His smile never reached his eyes. "This isn't the place." He leaned closer. "Let's step outside. We can sort this out privately." Then came the familiar tone, the one he had perfected over 11 years. Calm, reasonable, authoritative. The voice that never needed a shout because it had always found quieter ways to dominate. "You don't understand what you're doing," he continued. "Let's be rational about this." For years that voice had worked. For years it had convinced her to doubt herself. For years it had made her smaller. Not tonight. Adaeze slowly turned toward him. And for the first time since he had met her, Darnell found himself looking at a woman he did not recognize. The apology that had lived behind her eyes for years was gone. The hesitation was gone. The constant need to make others comfortable was gone. In its place stood something far stronger. A woman who had finally seen the full truth of herself. A woman who had survived humiliation, betrayal, grief, and loss. A woman who no longer needed anyone's permission to exist. She looked directly into his eyes. Then she spoke. Her voice wasn't loud. It didn't have to be. The room was already listening. "You burned a wrong woman's passport, Darnell." Silence. Absolute silence. The words landed like a hammer. People nearby stopped breathing. Conversations froze mid-sentence. Even the waitstaff paused, because everyone understood exactly what she meant. Darnell's hand dropped from her arm. Simone took a slow step backward, then another. For the first time all evening, she looked uncertain. The red dress that had demanded attention suddenly seemed painfully out of place. Claudette stared at the floral centerpiece in front of her, as if it contained the answers to life's mysteries. Renee's phone remained buried inside her purse. No recording this time. No captions. No audience to entertain. Tyrese quietly lowered his drink and said nothing, perhaps for the first time in his adult life. Adaeze turned away. She didn't wait for a response. She didn't seek revenge. She didn't demand apologies. She simply walked, slowly, gracefully, forward. Her mother had taught her something years earlier without ever saying it directly. Never look back at something you've already outgrown. So she didn't. Not once. The consequences arrived afterward. Not dramatically. Not all at once. Real consequences rarely do. Instead, they arrived quietly, relentlessly, like water finding cracks in a foundation. Darnell's lawyers searched for leverage and found none. Every assumption he had made collapsed. The house, the assets, the financial structures, the protections. Everything had been anticipated years earlier. Nkechi had built a fortress, and she had built it for her daughter. Meanwhile, the business community began drawing conclusions. Not because Adaeze attacked him, because they observed. People who spend their lives evaluating character pay attention when someone publicly humiliates a woman who turns out to be one of the most powerful figures in the room. Investors noticed. Partners noticed. Boards noticed. Conversations changed. Invitations slowed. Opportunities became harder to secure. His company didn't implode overnight. It simply shrank, quarter after quarter, deal after deal. Trust is difficult to earn, easy to lose, and impossible to force back once it's gone. Simone's departure hurt him most because it was so effortless. No argument, no dramatic goodbye, no tears. She stopped answering calls, then blocked his number, then disappeared. Just like that, the truth became painfully obvious. She had never chosen Darnell. She had chosen access. And when the access changed, so did her loyalty. The old video resurfaced online a month later. Not because Adaeze shared it. She never mentioned it. But powerful names attract attention. People found it, watched it, and reacted. Public opinion was brutal. Claudette attempted damage control through an interview. It failed, spectacularly. Renee disappeared from social media. Tyrese discovered that people who once laughed with him had become strangely quiet around him. None of them lost everything. Life rarely works that way. Justice is often subtler. It doesn't always destroy. Sometimes it simply removes protection. Sometimes it forces people to live inside the consequences of their own choices. And that can be far more uncomfortable. The morning after the gala, Adaeze flew to Atlanta. Mr. Ellington's team had secured emergency documentation within 48 hours. Another reminder that influence moves mountains ordinary people spend years climbing. She arrived before sunrise. The city was cool and gray, still waking up. She went directly to the hospital. The hallway was quiet. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant and coffee. When she opened the door to her mother's room, the first thing she noticed was the morning light stretching across the floor. The second thing she noticed was that her mother was awake. Nkechi looked toward her daughter, and in that moment, nothing else mattered. Not the money, not the inheritance, not the gala, not Darnell. Nothing, just a mother and daughter. Nkechi's eyes moved immediately to the gold pendant resting against Adaeze's throat. A soft expression crossed her face. Not quite a smile. Not quite relief. Something deeper. Something peaceful. She didn't ask questions. She didn't need answers. Mothers like Nkechi don't rely on words. They read hearts. They read posture. They read silence. And the moment she saw her daughter, she understood. The fear was gone. The shrinking was gone. Adaeze was standing fully inside herself. Nkechi closed her eyes briefly. A silent thank you. A quiet acknowledgement that the work was finished. Adaeze sat beside the bed and took her mother's hand. For hours they remained together. Sometimes they talked. About childhood memories. About Atlanta. About pepper soup on rainy Sundays. About things that seemed small but never truly were. Sometimes they sat in silence. And the silence said enough. 3 days later, on a Sunday morning filled with golden light, Nkechi passed away. Adaeze was holding her hand. She did not die afraid. She did not die worried. She did not die wondering whether her daughter would survive. Because she had already seen the answer. The answer was sitting beside her. Strong, whole, ready. She had built the bridge, and her daughter had crossed it. That was enough. Months later, after the estate was settled and the divorce finalized, Adaeze sat inside a home she had chosen for herself. A modest house in a peaceful Atlanta neighborhood, far smaller than what a woman worth $59 billion could afford. Exactly as she intended. There was room for a garden, a kitchen filled with morning sunlight, a porch where she could hear children playing in the evening. Nkechi would have loved it, not because it impressed people, because it felt like peace. The gold pendant rested on the table before her. Lately she found herself holding it more than wearing it, turning it over in her hands, thinking about everything it represented. That morning she picked it up again, carefully, the way her mother used to hold precious things. Not tightly, never desperately, just with certainty. While unpacking old boxes a few weeks earlier, she had discovered a folded piece of paper. Her own handwriting covered the front. Inside was something she had written years ago after one of her mother's talks. A reminder she hadn't realized she would one day need. The note read, "Some women stay quiet not because they have nothing to say, but because they are waiting for the moment the world is finally ready to hear who they have always been." Adaeze smiled, and she placed the pendant around her neck. It settled against her skin. Familiar, steady, warm. She walked to the window. Outside, the morning stretched before her. Bright, open, unwritten. For the first time in years, everything ahead belonged to her. Not because of the money, not because of the victory, not because of what she survived, but because she finally understood what her mother had spent a lifetime teaching her. Power isn't given, worth isn't granted, and freedom begins the moment you stop asking permission to be yourself. Adaeze stood there for a long moment, breathing, remembering, becoming. Then she smiled at the future waiting beyond the glass and stepped toward it. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs the reminder today. And if you're new here, subscribe and turn on notification for more unforgettable stories of resilience, justice, and transformation. We'll see you in the next story.